Many might have thought that after their joint victory over the Persians, Greece had finally found unity. The Spartan hoplites and Athenian sailors who fought side by side at Plataea and Salamis seemed to have forged an unbreakable alliance. But this was only the calm before the storm. Beneath the surface of heroic brotherhood, the seeds of a deep, irrational enmity were already sprouting, which in a few decades would plunge the Hellenic world into a 27-year fratricidal war. The reasons for this hatred ran much deeper than disputes over territory or trade routes. They lay in the very worldview of the two great city-states.
Imagine a Spartan elder, a member of the Gerousia, sitting on a rough stone bench. He is listening to a report from his Corinthian allies. The messenger, a weather-beaten merchant, speaks with alarm, not of enemy armies, but of the ubiquitous Athenian ships. They are everywhere, in the ports of Ionia, off the coast of Thrace, on the trade routes to the Black Sea. They are not just trading, they are dictating terms, collecting tribute, and establishing their own rules. To a Spartan, whose world is limited to the Eurotas Valley and the power of the phalanx, it sounded like a tale of a monster awakening from the depths of the sea.
After the end of the Greco-Persian Wars in 479 BC, Athens initiated the creation of the Delian League. Initially, it was a defensive alliance created to protect the Greek cities of Asia Minor from the Persian threat. The allies had to either provide ships or contribute money, phoros, to a common treasury, which was kept on the sacred island of Delos. However, over time, Athens, which had the most powerful fleet, began to turn the alliance into an instrument of its own power. In 454 BC, under the pretext of security, they moved the alliance's treasury from Delos to Athens, directly to the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis. This symbolic act marked the transformation of the alliance into the Athenian maritime power, or arche. The money that the allies paid for their common defense now went towards the construction of the Parthenon and the maintenance of the Athenian fleet of more than 200 triremes, fast warships that were the pinnacle of naval technology at the time. For Sparta, whose economy was based on agriculture and the labor of enslaved helots, such wealth seemed unthinkable and dangerous. The Spartans traditionally dominated on land, their phalanx being an invincible force. But what good is a land army if the enemy controls the sea, trade, and finances of the entire Aegean basin? Athens could strike anywhere, anytime, and then hide behind its long walls which connected the city to the port of Piraeus. Sparta found itself in the position of a mighty bull surrounded on all sides by a pack of swift and elusive wolves. It was this deep existential fear, rather than simple envy, that was the main driving force behind Spartan hostility. As the historian Thucydides, a contemporary of those events, accurately noted, the growth of Athenian power and the fear it inspired in the Spartans made war inevitable. Before the first trumpet sounded, heralding the start of the Peloponnesian War, the spears of the Spartans and Athenians had already crossed on the battlefields. These early clashes, often referred to as the Lesser Peloponnesian War, became a kind of trial of strength and only served to reinforce mutual animosity. In 457 BC, the Spartan army, returning from a campaign in central Greece, found itself trapped in Boeotia. Their way home was blocked by a large Athenian army. A fierce battle took place near the city of Tanagra. Imagine a young Athenian hoplite going into battle for the first time against the legendary Spartans. He sees before him a wall of bronze shields with the red letter lambda, and hears the steady, frightening clang of spears against shields. The battle was fierce and bloody. The Spartans, thanks to their training and discipline, won the victory, but it came at a high price. They suffered such heavy losses that they were unable to build on their success and simply went home, leaving the Athenians in control of the region. But the most telling event occurred just 62 days later. Instead of losing heart after their defeat, the Athenians assembled a new army, invaded Boeotia, and defeated the Thebans, Sparta's main allies in the region, at the Battle of Enophytes. This episode made a stunning impression on the Spartans. They were accustomed to the idea that after one decisive battle, the enemy would be broken for many years to come. Athens, however, demonstrated incredible vitality, the ability to quickly recover and strike back. This was something new and frightening. It became clear that Athens was not just a rich trading city with a strong fleet. It was a military power ready to challenge Spartan hegemony even on land. These early skirmishes did not resolve the differences, but only deepened the rift between the two city-states, showing that compromise was impossible. At the heart of the conflict lay not only military or economic differences, but also a profound ideological divide. Sparta and Athens were not just different cities, they were two opposing models of society, two different views of what a person and a state should be. Sparta was a closed, militarized oligarchy. The life of a Spartan from birth to death was subordinated to the interests of the state. Boys were taken from their families at the age of 7 and sent to military camps, agella, where they were raised in the spirit of the harshest discipline, endurance, and contempt for luxury. Power belonged to a small circle of people, 2 kings, a council of elders, gerousia, and a college of 5 ephors. The entire system was aimed at maintaining stability and order, at preserving power over the huge mass of enslaved helots who could rise up at any moment. New ideas, trade, art, all of this was considered dangerous and subversive. Athens was the complete opposite. It was a noisy, open, dynamic democracy. Any full citizen could participate in the People's Assembly, ecclesia, make proposals, and vote on important issues. The city was a center of trade, philosophy, theater, and architecture. In the Athenian port of Piraeus, you could meet merchants from all over the Mediterranean and hear dozens of different languages. The Athenians were proud of their freedom, their right to their own opinion, and their openness to the world. This antagonism could not help but spill over beyond their own walls. Athens actively supported democratic parties in other Greek city-states, seeing this as a natural extension of its values. For Sparta, this was tantamount to exporting revolution. Every city where Democrats came to power broke away from Spartan influence and became a potential ally of Athens. Sparta, in turn, supported oligarchic regimes, seeing them as guarantors of stability and order. The Greek world was divided into 2 camps, and this ideological Cold War constantly threatened to escalate into a hot one. As the Athenian leader Pericles said in his famous funeral oration, immortalized by Thucydides, "Our state system does not imitate foreign institutions. Our city is open to all, and we never expel foreigners for fear that someone might learn or see something useful to us in military terms, since we rely not so much on military preparations and cunning as on our inherent courage in open action." This Athenian self-confidence had a darker side, which the Spartans and their allies saw much more clearly. Behind the facade of democratic ideals lay the iron grip of imperialism. Woe betide any member of the Delian League who decided they had had enough. In 471 B.C., the island of Naxos, one of the largest and richest members of the League, attempted to leave. Athens' response was swift and ruthless. A fleet built with common funds besieged the island, demolished its walls, confiscated its ships, and turned free allies into subjects obliged to pay tribute. A few years later, the same fate befell the wealthy island of Thasos, which dared to challenge Athenian control over the gold mines in Thrace. After a 2-year siege, the Phaeacians were forced to surrender their fleet, destroy their walls, and pay a huge contribution. These events sent a loud signal to the entire Greek world. The Delian League was a trap from which there was no escape. For conservative Sparta, which valued autonomy, and the traditional way of life, patriotic polity, above all else, Athenian policy was the height of tyranny. They saw Athens like a predatory octopus spreading its tentacles to all corners of the Aegean Sea, subjugating the once free Hellenes. There was another deeply personal episode that permanently poisoned relations between the two city-states. In 464 BC, a terrible earthquake struck Sparta. The city was almost completely destroyed, and thousands of people died, including entire groups of young Spartans. Taking advantage of the chaos, the Helots, who had been oppressed by the Spartans for centuries, staged the most massive and dangerous uprising in their history. They captured several fortresses and entrenched themselves on Mount Etoma in Messenia. Sparta's situation was desperate. For the first time in many years, it was on the verge of complete destruction. In this critical situation, the Spartans, swallowing their pride, turned to all their allies in the Hellenic League, including Athens, for help. At that time, a politician named Cimon, son of the famous Miltiades, hero of Marathon, was very influential in Athens. Cimon was known for his pro-Spartan views and believed that Greece should be lame but not on one leg, meaning that the power of Athens and Sparta should balance each other. He persuaded the People's Assembly to send an impressive contingent of 4,000 hoplites to help the Spartans. The Athenians, known for their skill in siege warfare, arrived at Mount Etoma. However, their presence aroused suspicion rather than gratitude among the Spartans. The Spartan elders, looking at the Athenian warriors, free-thinking, curious, accustomed to asking questions, were frightened. They feared that the Athenian democratic contagion might spread to their own allies or even to the Helots. What if the Athenians, instead of storming the fortress, began to negotiate with the rebels? This fear outweighed military necessity. The Spartans committed an act unheard of by the standards of Hellenic hospitality and allied duty. They unilaterally refused to help the Athenians and unceremoniously expelled their army from Laconia, declaring that their help was no longer needed. For the Athenians, this was an unforgivable insult. Their offer of help had been rejected with contempt. A political crisis erupted in Athens. Cimon, the initiator of the pro-Spartan policy, was ostracized and expelled from the city. His opponents came to power, radical Democrats led by Ephialtes and the young Pericles, who considered Sparta an enemy rather than a partner. The humiliation at Mount Etoma became the point of no return, after which the moderate voices in both city-states fell silent, and the hawks, convinced of the inevitability of war, came to power. The conflict was also flaring up on the economic front. Athens, controlling the sea routes, sought to unify the economic space of its empire. They began to impose on their allies the use of the Athenian silver coin, the famous owl, as the main currency, as well as Athenian measures of weight and volume. This was not just a convenience for trade, but a powerful tool of control. Athens' main trading competitor in Greece was Corinth, a wealthy oligarchic polis, a key ally of Sparta, and the founder of the Peloponnesian League. Corinthian merchants saw the Athenians gradually ousting them from their traditional markets in Italy and Sicily. Athenian expansion to the west threatened Corinth's vital interests, and the Corinthians constantly pushed the indecisive Sparta to take tougher action against Athens. It was this tangle of contradictions, fear, ideology, old grudges, and economic interests that exploded into two local conflicts which became the immediate cause of the war. The first broke out around the island of Kerkyra, modern-day Corfu. Corfu was an old colony of Corinth, but over time it had become a powerful maritime power, with the second largest fleet in Greece after Athens. A conflict broke out between the metropolis and the colony over control of the city of Epidamnus on the Adriatic coast. Corinth and Kerkyra went to war. Defeated in a naval battle, the Corinthians began to prepare a huge fleet for revenge. The frightened Kerkyrians, who had previously adhered to a policy of neutrality, sent envoys to Athens with a request for an alliance. This was a dilemma for the Athenians. An alliance with Corfu meant inevitable conflict with Corinth, and as a result with all of Sparta. But refusal meant that Corfu's powerful fleet would fall into the hands of their enemies. The strategic advantage prevailed. Athens concluded a defensive alliance with Corcyra and sent a small squadron to its shores with orders not to engage in battle, but only to defend the island in case of a landing. In 433 BC, the fleets of Corinth and Corcyra clashed off the Symbothian Islands. In the heat of battle, when the Corinthians began to retreat, the Athenian triremes intervened, preventing a complete defeat. For the Corinthians, this was an act of open war. The second spark was Plataea, a city on the Chalkidiki Peninsula. The history of Plataea was uniquely complicated. It was a colony of Corinth, but at the same time it was part of the Delian League and paid tribute to Athens. Fearing that Plataea would leave the league under the influence of Corinth, Athens demanded that the Plataeans demolish part of the city walls, hand over hostages, and expel officials sent from Corinth. This was a direct interference in internal affairs and a humiliation. The Plataeans, having secretly secured a promise from Sparta to invade Attica if Athens attacked them, refused to comply with the demands and rebelled. Athens immediately sent troops and laid siege to the city. Now all the threads converged at one point. The Corinthians, enraged by the events in Corcyra and Plataea, arrived in Sparta and addressed the assembly of the Peloponnesian League with a fiery speech, accusing the Athenians of violating the peace and calling on the Spartans to finally fulfill their alliance obligations. They were supported by the Megarians, who were suffering from the Athenian economic blockade, the very same Megarian psephism that closed all the markets and ports of the Athenian Empire to them. A decisive debate took place in Sparta. King Archidamus, an old and wise ruler, called for caution. He understood that the war with Athens would be long, exhausting, and unlike previous conflicts. But his voice was drowned out by war cries. The decisive word was spoken by the ephor Sthenelade. His speech was Spartan in its brevity and sharpness. I do not understand the long speeches of the Athenians. They have offended many of our allies and ourselves. If we are men of honor, we will not abandon our allies in trouble, and we will not delay in taking revenge. Others have a lot of money, ships, and horses, but we have loyal allies. Vote, Lacedaemonians, for war as the honor of Sparta demands. By an overwhelming majority, the Spartan assembly declared that the Athenians had violated the peace treaty. The path to the bloodiest war in the history of ancient Greece was now open. For the Spartans, whose worldview was shaped by constant internal threats, peace was a fragile construct, held together by strict order and unshakable traditions. Any change was perceived as a potential crack in the foundation through which chaos could flood into their world. Athenian democracy, with its cult of personality, rhetorical contests, and constant political innovations, was not just a foreign ideology, it was an existential threat. The Spartans practiced xenolasia, the periodic expulsion of foreigners from their territory, fearing that they would bring with them dangerous ideas that could corrupt the youth, or worse, inspire the helots. And now an entire empire had grown up on their borders that not only tolerated these ideas, but cultivated them, spreading them throughout the Hellenic world. Every Athenian orator who spoke from the podium about freedom and equality of citizens sounded to the Spartan ephor like an instigator of rebellion, addressing directly the millions of enslaved Messenians and Lacedaemonians, on whose labor and fear the entire prosperity of Sparta depended. This hatred was fueled not so much by envy of Athenian wealth as by a panic-stricken fear of losing control of their own house. The speeches of the Corinthian ambassadors in Sparta, recorded by Thucydides, were not just a complaint, but a well-thought-out psychological blow aimed at the very heart of Spartan pride. They did not ask, they shamed. You, Spartans, are the only ones among the Hellenes who are inactive, believing that you defend yourselves not by force, but by delay.
The Athenians, on the other hand, are innovators, quick in their plans and in the execution of their designs. They spend their whole lives in labor and danger. They consider rest to be a misfortune, and prefer active restlessness to idleness. In short, if anyone said that they were born into this world to have no peace themselves and to give no peace to others, he would be speaking the truth. This accusation of slowness and passivity was a profound insult to the Spartans, who considered themselves the defenders of Hellenic freedom. The Corinthians skillfully contrasted Spartan inertia with Athenian energy, making the Spartans feel that they were missing a historic moment and risking losing not only their allies but also their own dignity. This verbal challenge, delivered before the eyes of the entire Peloponnesian League, made the war a matter of honor. Behind the disputes over Corfu and Plataea lay cold geopolitical calculations. Control of Plataea meant not only power over an important trading hub, but also access to the rich forests of Chalkidiki, a source of shipbuilding timber, and to the gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaeus. For Athens, whose power rested on its navy, an uninterrupted supply of timber was a matter of life and death. The alliance with Corcyra was an even more important prize. Its fleet of about 100 triremes was the only force capable of rivaling that of Athens. If this fleet had gone over to the Peloponnesian League, Athens' naval supremacy would have been threatened. By forming an alliance with Corcyra, the Athenians were not simply helping a new friend. They were neutralizing a powerful weapon that could be used against them, and securing a safe sea route to the west, to the rich resources of Sicily and southern Italy. Both sides understood that these local conflicts were merely a prelude to the struggle for complete domination. Finally, we must not forget the legal side of the issue. The 30 Years' Peace, concluded in 446 BC after the Peloponnesian War, was not just a truce, but a complex treaty that was supposed to regulate relations between the two blocs. It contained a clause on mandatory arbitration to resolve any future disputes. By intervening in the conflict between Corinth and Corcyra and then issuing an ultimatum to Plataea, Athens, from the point of view of the Spartans and their allies, grossly violated this very clause. They preferred force to negotiation, demonstrating that they did not consider themselves bound by any agreements if they contradicted their interests. This gave Sparta a formal, legally impeccable basis for declaring war. Now they could act not as aggressors, but as defenders of violated rights and avengers of a trampled treaty. Thus, by the time of the decisive vote in Sparta, all factors had come together.
existential fear, ideological incompatibility, personal grievances, economic interests, strategic calculations, and finally, a sense of self-righteousness. The cup of patience was full. The Spartan military machine concealed a fundamental vulnerability. The number of full citizens, the equals, was steadily declining due to losses and strict laws. By the start of the war, there were only a few thousand left, an elite ruling over hundreds of thousands of hostile helots. This existential fear gave rise to the Plataea, a secret police whose young warriors terrorized the helots at night, killing the strongest among them. Against this backdrop, King Archidamis's warnings sounded particularly weighty, for he was bound to Pericles by ties of hospitality and xenia, and knew personally the unyielding will of his Athenian counterpart. For Sparta, the war was not just a matter of hegemony, but also a desperate attempt to preserve its fragile peace, built on oppression, from Athenian influence, which could spark an all-consuming uprising. It was a battle for the survival of their unique system, which Athenian openness threatened to destroy from within, turning the external enemy into an internal ally of the enslaved masses. Sparta's hatred of Athens was not caused by a single reason, but was the result of a complex intertwining of fear of growing power, ideological contradictions, and a series of specific conflicts. From Athens' naval dominance to economic sanctions, each factor undermined the fragile balance in ancient Greece. The Peloponnesian War, which lasted 27 years, was the tragic consequence of this enmity, reminding us how deep-seated fears and political ambitions can lead to widespread destruction. Understanding these real reasons helps us to see lessons in history that are still relevant today.